At the center of this tragedy are John Reynolds, a devoted ex-Marine, his loving but often lonely wife, Emily Reynolds, and Father Mark, a charming and mysterious priest. Their once peaceful lives are gradually drawn into a spiral of lies and tragedy that will haunt the sleepy town of Meadowbrook forever. John and Emily Reynolds appear to be the perfect couple. After more than a decade of marriage, they have built a stable and respectable life together. John, an ex-Marine, is admired for his discipline and honesty. At the same time, Emily is a devoted wife and stay-at-home mother, beloved for her kindness and active role in community activities. Their marriage is a solid foundation in the town's social circle. But beneath the peaceful exterior, Emily suffers from a persistent loneliness. John's new job as a security consultant for a large corporation requires him to be away from home frequently, leaving Emily to care for their 2 children alone. The prestigious job consumed John's time and energy, and Emily was consumed by longing and lonely evenings. She threw herself into community activities, attending church more and more, but the void in her heart grew larger and larger. Father Mark, the new priest at St. Mary's Church, had extraordinary charisma. His passionate sermons attracted more and more parishioners each week. He can understand people's deepest feelings, offering them comfort and spiritual guidance. Emily was quickly drawn to his charm, finding empathy in the priest's words. She spent more and more time at church, trying to fill the void left by John's absence. As John's absences increased, Emily's relationship with Father Mark deepened. To her, he was not just a priest, but also a confidant who always listened without judgment. Their conversations begin as religious, but gradually become more personal and more intimate. Emily feels a connection between them that she has never felt with anyone else, a sense of being truly understood and appreciated. But beneath his benevolent facade, Father Mark harbors his secrets and ambitions. He senses Emily's vulnerability and takes advantage of the opportunity to draw her closer. Their affair begins like any other tragedy, with whispers. Meadowbrook is a small town where no secret can stay hidden forever. Absorbed in his work protecting important people from outside dangers, John is unaware that the greatest threat is brewing within his own home. Father Mark arrives at Meadowbrook as the parish's new priest and becomes a beloved figure. He was magnetic, not only because of his inspiring sermons, but also because of his genuine concern for his parishioners. Already active in church activities, Emily became increasingly drawn to his warmth and charisma. At first, their relationship was a harmless sharing. Emily came to church for comfort, and Father Mark was always ready to listen. Gradually, their distance blurred, and the line between a priest and a married woman was erased. Their intimate conversations became more private and profound, and soon they could no longer deny their mutual attraction. Father Mark was utterly captivated by Emily's sincerity and vulnerability. He saw in her a woman who was longing to be heard, to be loved, and Emily, for the first time in years, felt truly appreciated. And so, they rushed into each other without regard for the consequences, unaware that they were writing the opening chapter of an inevitable tragedy. Father Mark finds himself drawn to Emily as a parishioner seeking spiritual guidance and a woman of great charm. Their meetings become more frequent and private, taking place in quiet corners of the church where the light is dim, and the ancient walls seem to hide every secret. The lines between them gradually become blurred, and an unspoken tension creeps into every glance. The taboo nature of a priest falling in love with a married woman only makes every furtive glance, every quiet conversation between them, all the more dangerous and stimulating. As their relationship progresses, their meetings are no longer confined to the church grounds. Under spiritual guidance, Emily and Father Mark begin to meet outside. Together, they walk the quiet country roads, sharing laughter and deep secrets that no one else has ever known. But the strong emotional connection did not stop at words. It quickly turned into physical desire. The accidental touches became prolonged, the fingers lightly gliding over the skin as if exploring a taboo full of fascination. They rushed into each other in an irresistible desire, indulging in moments of passionate secrecy. The clandestine meetings were hidden in the dark, where the old walls of the church or the hidden corners that no one expected became witnesses to their burning passion. Every time they were together, they broke the sacred boundary, surrendering to the intense attraction that drew them closer. But along with that excitement was the terrible weight of the secret they were hiding. Every touch, every whisper reminded them of the taboos they were defying to have each other. And that made this love more passionate, more dangerous than ever. The relationship between Emily and Father Mark gradually becomes an uncontrollable fire, consuming their minds and dominating their every move. As they become more immersed in their passion, they become more reckless, meeting in dangerous places and leaving subtle but indistinct traces. The changes in Emily are increasingly evident. She becomes distant from John, avoiding his gaze, her former steadiness now replaced by a restlessness. Father Mark is not immune to the effects of this relationship. His sermons become more passionate, reflecting the conflict within him. Between sacred vows and mortal desires, between sin and pleasure. He knows he is crossing a line of no return but cannot stop. Emily has become a part of him, a feeling he has never experienced, an excitement filling the emptiness that the priesthood cannot provide. But then, like all secrets, the truth begins to crack. John, who trusts his wife implicitly, begins to notice strange changes. Emily's nights away, her mysterious phone calls, her growing distance from him, all are pieces of a terrifying picture he doesn't want to look at. His suspicions grow, and soon he begins to piece together the signs of betrayal. Not only John, but the entire Meadowbrook community begins to whisper. A small town like this can never keep a secret for long. Meadowbrook is a small town where no secret can stay hidden for long. Here, everyone knows everyone else's business. And even the slightest change in Emily and Father Mark's relationship cannot escape the curious gazes of the people. Whispers spread like wildfire, turning their illicit relationship into the center of speculative conversation. Curious glances and backbiting turn Father Mark's name from that of a respected priest to a symbol of scandal and suspicion. But that's not the worst of it. As the rumors continue to spread, an even darker truth emerges. Emily is not the only woman Father Mark has seduced under the guise of spiritual guidance. Drawing on his charm and charisma, other women begin to speak out. They tell similar stories, secret meetings, sweet words that mask evil, and illicit relationships within the sacred walls of the church. Father Mark's image as a model priest crumbles as these truths come to light. He goes from being a community pillar to a hypocrite, despised by the public. But as his reputation crumbles, Father Mark's desperation becomes clear. He is willing to do anything, even terrible things, to keep his secret. Then a fateful event occurs. David, a faithful parishioner, accidentally witnesses Father Mark and Emily kissing in the confessional. Shock and anger are evident in David's eyes as he threatens to expose the truth to the entire community unless Father Mark confesses. But Father Mark cannot let that happen. His fear of public exposure leads him to devise a ruthless plan. He pretended to want to see David alone, talk, and explain. And then one dark, quiet night, a perfect night for what he intended, Father Mark lured David up to the church bell tower. Standing at the tower's edge, David continued to push, his voice growing louder with excitement. But he didn't realize the danger that lurked. Only for a moment, just one hard, quick, and ruthless push. David slipped, eyes wide with panic as his body lost its balance. He scrabbled, trying to grab onto anything he could, but there was nothing but air and the void below. A scream tore through the quiet night as he fell, taking his life and the secret he was about to expose with him. The fall seemed to last forever before his body hit the ground, a sickening clang that echoed in the night. Blood spread into a crimson pool around his grotesquely twisted body. From above, Father Mark looked down. His heart pounded, not with terror, but with relief. The secret was safe. He hurried out of the bell tower, sure no one had seen what had happened. In the darkness, he dragged David's body to a hidden corner of the church's basement, where the dusty old furniture could hide everything. His hands shook, but when the morning light returned, he stood at the pulpit, continuing his sermon as if nothing had happened. Meadowbrook is a small town where no secret can stay hidden forever. David's disappearance never went unnoticed, but when no trace or body was ever found, the case faded into mystery. The townspeople still gossiped, but as time passed, the questions dwindled. Father Mark stood among the community with a worried face and a sympathetic voice, comforting them, sharing their grief, and appearing to be a devoted spiritual leader. But inside, he was never at peace. Every unexpected sound, every shadow that passed made him jump, his heart pounding. He knew he had gambled with fate and learned a tiny mistake could cause everything to fall apart. Yet for now, he stood firm, continued to preach, and offered hope to others, while imprisoned in fear and guilt. Emily had no idea of the horrors Father Mark had gone to keep his secret. She had only noticed a change in him, a quiet darkness, a constant unease in his eyes. But whenever she expressed concern, Father Mark would smile, brushing away her doubts with gentle reassurance. He tried to convince himself that he could move on, that he could bury his guilt along with David's body. But with each passing day, the burden weighed heavier on him, forcing him to fight to maintain his cover. The police, after weeks of investigation without any leads or suspects, finally dropped the case. There was no evidence, no confession, nothing to convict Father Mark. He began to believe he had gotten away with it. But the memory of that night never left him. It haunted his dreams and infiltrated his waking moments. He may have silenced David forever, but the torment still haunted him like an inescapable ghost. And then what John had always feared finally happened before his eyes. He believed his life was built on a solid foundation of love, trust, and shared dreams with Emily. But lately, he had noticed an invisible distance growing between them. Emily was absent-minded, lost in thought, and often absent from home. Doubt began to creep into his mind, gnawing at every corner of the trust he had placed in his wife. Determined to find the truth, John secretly followed Emily one gloomy afternoon. He followed her silently, and the pursuit led him to St. Mary's Church. He saw her slowly enter the sanctuary with a mysterious look. John's heart pounded as he crept inside, hiding behind the altar, watching from the most hidden place. From his hiding place, he saw Emily standing there, a far cry from the image he was used to. She looked more alive, her face glowing with a happiness that John hadn't seen in months. And the one making her happy was Father Mark. The charismatic priest stood closer to her than necessary. Then, in a moment that made John's blood boil, Father Mark gently placed his hand on Emily's arm, a gesture so intimate, so meaningful. John didn't need any more proof. The sight before him was like a knife stabbing into his heart, confirming his worst fears. His wife and the priest they had both trusted were having an affair. Rage exploded. John couldn't control himself anymore. He stormed out of his hiding place, his footsteps echoing through the cathedral. Emily turned, startled, her face pale as if seeing a ghost. Father Mark, who usually kept his cool in any situation, showed brief panic for the first time. The confrontation immediately flared up like a storm. John's voice, heavy with betrayal, echoed throughout the church. Every word he uttered was like a sharp knife, full of anger and hurt. "How could you do this to me?" His voice cracked with each word, pained, indignant. "To me? To our family?" Emily was stunned, stuttering for an explanation. Tears welled in her eyes, but no words could erase what had just happened. "John, it's not what you think." She tried to speak, but couldn't even believe her words. Heavy guilt hung in the air. Father Mark attempted to intervene, his voice calm but desperate. Hands raised in a gesture of reconciliation, he pleaded, "John, please listen. Things are not worth misunderstanding. It's more complicated than you think." But John could no longer listen to any of the words. Burning with rage, betrayed by the two people he had trusted the most, all he saw was red flooding his mind. John roared, rage seething in every muscle, in every heavy breath. His entire body shook with uncontrollable rage, his fists clenched until they were white. The air in the church was thick and tense to the point of suffocation. Then, like an unstoppable storm, John lunged at Father Mark. The priest, who had always maintained his composure in every situation, was now forced to act in self-defense to protect himself and keep the dark secret he had tried so hard to hide. His eyes frantically scanned the area around him, searching for a weapon. And then, right next to the altar, a large, heavy cross gleamed in the dim light. Father Mark desperately grabbed the cross, lifting it with all his might. Snap! The first blow landed on John's forehead with a loud bang, sending blood flying everywhere. He staggered, but the rage remained. He did not stop. John, driven by rage, charged again. But Father Mark, now consumed by terror, no longer held back. Smack! 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 Each swing of the crucifix was more potent than the last, crushing bones and tearing flesh. Blood spattered the altar, staining the sacred symbol red. The sound of each blow echoed through the sacred space of the church, turning the place into a horrific murder scene. And then, the final blow. A deafening sound. John's skull shattered. His body collapsed to the floor, lying motionless in a pool of crimson blood. The crucifix, no longer a symbol of faith, had become a bloody weapon, dripping onto the cold floor. Father Mark stood over John's motionless body, his entire body trembling, his hands soaked in blood and torn flesh. The room was so quiet he could hear his own heart pounding. On the stone floor, John's face was twisted, almost unrecognizable, crushed by the fatal blows. The silence was long, heavy, broken only by a heart-rending scream. "Emily!" She collapsed beside John's body, eyes wide with horror, tears of despair streaming down her pale face. "John!" Her voice trailed off, drowned in endless pain. Once filled with love and hope, her life was now reduced to ruin and tragedy. And Father Mark. He stood there, staring at his bloody hands, staring at the body of the man he had called a friend, a believer. And then the truth hit him like a knife. There was no turning back. Panic. He turned and ran, leaving behind a chaotic scene that would haunt the church forever. But he was running not only from the scene of the crime, but also from the guilt that was crushing him. Red and blue lights flashed across the narrow streets of Meadowbrook. Emily, still in a state of shock, called 911. Her voice trembled as she recounted what had just happened, a story of horror that she could hardly believe. Father Mark, covered in blood, rushed from the church, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. Meadowbrook, the town that had been his haven, had become a giant trap. But the search was not over. When the police stormed the church, combing every corner, they discovered something even more horrifying than John's murder. In a dark corner of the basement, David's body was found mangled, the marks of his fatal fall still visible. 2 men, 2 victims, 1 murderer. The truth was undeniable. Father Mark, once the hope and faith of so many, was now nothing more than a monster. "All units, we have a suspect on the run." The police radio blared urgently. "Father Mark is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Approach with caution." Meanwhile, Father Mark weaved through the dark alleys, breathing rapidly, eyes scanning every corner in panic. He knew he didn't have much time. The police would soon be closing in on the entire town. The only way out, the woods at the edge of Meadowbrook. If he could get into the woods, maybe he could escape. But there was one person who wouldn't let that happen. Detective Miller, a seasoned officer, had seen countless similar cases. She didn't believe in hypocrites and never gave up in her pursuit of justice. "Block all the exits. He won't get away." She knew Meadowbrook like the back of her hand, and she knew that no matter how fast Father Mark ran, the hand of justice would catch him. Barricades were erected at all the main exits. Police scoured the streets and surrounding areas, and Father Mark's heart pounded as he reached the edge of town. Ahead, the dense forest loomed as a last ray of hope. He glanced back, the flashing lights of police in the darkness, the wail of sirens echoing as if signaling the end of a fugitive's life. Father Mark plunged into the woods with the last of his strength, his mind a jumble of fear and despair. The underbrush tore at his clothes, and branches and roots protruding from the ground kept tripping him up, his breathing coming in rapid, ragged gasps. Every little sound, a rustling leaf, a snapping branch, startled him, fearing that the police were near. As exhaustion began to take hold of his body, the reality of his sinful actions weighed heavily on him, dragging him down into the abyss of guilt and survival instinct. But he could go no further. Not far behind, Detective Miller led a squad of officers into the woods, flashlight beams cutting through the early morning mist. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, mingling with the tension of the chase. "He couldn't have gotten away," Miller said with conviction, his eyes scanning the telltale signs. Broken branches, deep footprints in the ground. The dogs barked, tugging on their leashes, picking up the scent of their quarry. Father Mark's strength waned as they marched more deeply into the woods. In his troubled mind, he thought of remorse, crime, and Emily, the woman who had unwittingly caused all this tragedy. The weight of his guilt was too much to bear, and a desperate thought flashed through his mind. If he couldn't escape justice, there was only one way to end it all. Suddenly, the barking of dogs echoed behind him. Panic rose, and Father Mark knew his time was up. He broke into one last run, but fear and exhaustion made him lose control. His legs wobbled and he stumbled, falling into a clearing, and immediately the light of police flashlights surrounded him. "Freeze! Put your hands up!" Detective Miller's voice boomed, authoritative and unapologetic. Father Mark gasped, falling to the ground, his bloody hands trembling in the air as a sign of surrender, but also as the most visible evidence of his crimes. The officers were quick to rush in, handcuffing him. The cold metal tightened around his wrists, a bondage not just of his body, but of his guilt that he would have to deal with for the rest of his life. But at that moment, Father Mark did not want to face justice. A glint of despair flashed in his eyes as he lunged toward a sharp rock, intending to end it all. But he didn't stand a chance. The officers reacted instantly, pulling him back, binding him tighter, ending any hope of escape. The sun rose over Meadowbrook, and the small town witnessed the fall of the man who had once been their most revered priest. Now, he was a captured murderer, his fate sealed by his crimes. The trial was swift, the evidence incontrovertible, and a life sentence was handed down to the man who once preached forgiveness from the pulpit without the possibility of parole. But there was no forgiveness for him. In the cold cell, the concrete walls became a mirror of irredeemable sins. The whispers of the other prisoners, the isolation, the darkness of his conscience. These were the cruelest punishments he had ever endured. He had tried to escape justice, but now he would spend the rest of his life facing it head-on. As for Meadowbrook, though the town was slowly recovering, the memory of Father Mark's betrayal and the horror of his crimes would never fade. The church, once a place of peace, was now a symbol of the darkness that once enveloped it. And so Father Mark served his life in prison, haunted by the ghosts of his past. His failed escape attempt, like his life, was a perpetual reminder of the inevitable punishment of justice.